So on the right of Drew, on Drew's left, we've got Mark Boutin, who's the CEO of the National Health Council. And Mark has been, and the National Health Council, have been a leading voice for greater patient involvement at every stage of the healthcare continuum, starting with the development of new drugs to regulatory oversight of healthcare delivery and shared decision making. We're especially pleased, Mark, that you're here because he partnered with us and played a critical role in our advisory committee as we were working on the 21st Century Cures Act and informing and supporting work there. So welcome back. It's great to have you. On Mark's left, we're pleased that Oscar Levak is with us today. He comes to us from Cornell University Law School. He's a professor of law there, has a PhD in physics, focusing on techniques for determining protein structure, and he also received his law degree from Yale. And then part of his background, he was a postdoctoral scientist working on physical realization of quantum computing in the Quantum Information Group at IBM's Almaden Research Center in California. And then finally, we're so pleased to have Gil Boy with us today. He comes to us from Indianapolis, flew in. Gil is the Vice President and Deputy General Patent Counsel at Eli Lilly and Company, and he's been with Lilly since 1994. And his practice within Lilly's legal group has spanned all aspects of things like patient procurement, litigation, transactions, and administration, as well as counseling Lilly's oncology business unit. And as a co-author of a representative number of amicus briefs, that's, for the patent attorneys in the room. Gil has been active in efforts to shape the legal environment governing pharmaceutical drug discovery and development. So that's our panel. And I thought we'd get started. Mark, you're so good at sort of laying the foundation for discussions. I wonder if you might talk about the role of intellectual property, IP protections, or patent policies in supporting this notion of innovation, competition, and patient access when it comes to medical products generally, Mark, as well as biologics. That might set the stage for us.
Sure, Janet. Let me start by thanking you, Janet, and your team, Tim, and all the other folks that worked on this issue. These issues are critically important to all people with chronic conditions. And I think sometimes we forget because the complexity of this issue is largely ignored and often taken for granted. I just wanted to set the stage a little bit by saying that I've been a patient advocate for more than 25 years. I actually have a British law degree, had lived abroad since I was 13, and was about to start working in the European communities when, over a period of just a few short months, everyone in my family was diagnosed with one or more chronic conditions, which ranged from heart disease, cancer, neurologic, autoimmune, HIV, and some others. I ended up moving back to the United States, settled in Boston, and worked in a law firm and volunteered with a number of patient organizations. And then over again, a relatively short period of time, all these people lost their lives, either because there were no effective treatments or the treatments were ineffectively deployed. We in the patient community have a huge stake in ensuring innovation. And I want to start by making 2 points as part of this stage setting. One is, I'd like to ask the audience, what is the most important invention in the history of man?
Wheel.
What's that?
The wheel. Wheel. The wheel.
The wheel? Any others?
What?
Don't be shy.
Penicillin.
Yeah. So you hear a lot of different things. I mean, if you ask some of our younger millennials, they'll tell you it's a smartphone. But it could be the computer, it could be electricity, it could be the light bulb, it could be what came out of the Industrial Revolution, even what came out of the Renaissance. The interesting piece about intellectual property is it's been around for centuries. It dates back to 500 BC. The Greeks had intellectual property for anyone who would improve a luxury. They would get a year of protection. This is not a new concept. So that's number one. It's been around and it's driven where we are today in society. It's a critical piece of everything that touches our lives. And for the more than 150 million people in the United States living with one or more chronic diseases, it has driven innovation to where we are now. And in fact, 10 years ago, when biologics were coming into the market, people thought they had to deal with mostly treatments that dealt with their symptoms. And you started to see biologics fundamentally alter their lives in amazing ways. Now we see gene therapy and other interventions coming through that may be a one-time only treatment. That was science fiction 20 years ago. This is not a new concept. It's an ancient concept that has driven society the way we are today. The second point I'd like to make is this evolves. In 500 BC, you got a year of protection. Now for patents, you get a lot longer. There are different forms of intellectual property. There are different forms or protections to drive innovation in health. We as a society have to constantly look at our systems that are driving innovation and ensure that we get the balance correct. Because I can tell you, for the members the National Health Council represent, which are many of the patient advocacy organizations, and several of them are here in the room today, there are many, many conditions, in particular in the rare condition space, for whom there are no effective treatments. They simply get sick and die. Even for some very common diseases like Alzheimer's or ALS, no interventions medically that are going to save or prolong your life. We have to constantly look at our systems and decide what is the right balance between innovation, but also access. And I can tell you, when I speak with the CEOs of the patient groups in membership at the National Health Council, and we've been doing listening sessions, to the organization, to the CEO, every one of them will say, right now, my biggest concern is access to care. And with access comes affordability. You have to get that balance right. And I can tell you the pressures are tremendous. We see less money going into health innovation. And at the same time, we see people who are of lower socioeconomic status, even people of middle class, not getting access to the high-value interventions that exist. So again, not a new concept, but we as a society have to decide what that right balance is to promote innovation and promote access. And that evaluation is ongoing. And I think we're at a really interesting time in our history right now. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark, for those insightful remarks to start us off today. Gil, I wonder if you might offer your insights, the balancing innovation, competition, and patient access from a research and development industry perspective.
Sure. And first of all, thank you, Janet, for inviting me to the panel today, and Tim and all the work that you've done. It's very important. A patent system as a means to promote innovation, of course, is very important, as already sort of been discussed. I don't need to convince, I think, you, Mark, of that, or any of the rest of the panelists. The trick here, the key is the balance of coverage, of scope. So you want to have a robust, reliable patent system, particularly when the cost and time associated with making an invention are grossly disproportionate to the cost and time it is to copy that invention. The appropriate grant of patent coverage allows a period of time for an innovator to have exclusivity around their product. Exclusivity meaning there isn't a cheaply developed copy of the product on the market. During that period of time of exclusivity, the innovator has time to recoup investment, the investment is used to perhaps further study the existing invention and prove it. In the case of antibodies, that additional investment can drive new antibodies. So it's critically important to the ecosystem to have reliable protection around disclosed inventions, disclosed antibodies. Part of the high cost, if you will, is associated with developing a drug is, of course, the appropriate regulatory burdens that are placed on a pharmaceutical company to prove the safety and efficacy of a drug prior to putting it into widespread medical use. A second structurally unique antibody that comes to the table is not going to get a break, if you will, in the regulatory process of proving its safety and efficacy. So a second structurally unique antibody, structurally different drug, is going to have to prove itself independent from the antibody that came before it. So when you have a patent system that may inappropriately award patents to the first innovator, where the first innovator's claim scope, this is talked about Deputy Hirschfeld, where the claim scope is broader than actually what was disclosed through the patent disclosure, you may find that the second innovator, the second antibody, having a legal hurdle to being able to make it to the market. In a best case scenario, if that were to occur, the second innovator would essentially have to pay a tax to the first innovator for access to the patent. It would be a license fee, for example. In a worst case scenario, and this is a different picture on access, maybe the word access meant something different to most of the people in the room, but in a very real sense, the first innovator with the inappropriately broad patent could completely block the second medicine from reaching patients at all. That is really a high-level access problem. So, bottom line, I think, is yes, we need a very robust, reliable patent system to protect disclosed inventions, but we need to be careful that the coverage that's granted doesn't go beyond the scope of disclosed invention and thereby inhibit proper subsequent innovation.
Oscar, I wonder if you might weigh in as well. You've been studying patent law for a long time, particularly around emerging therapies. Any insights to add on this balance between innovation, competition, and access?
Well, I'll try to add to what Mark and Gil have just been relaying. And that is, certainly the IP has been around for a long time, but the controversies around IP have been around almost just as long. And so this is not the new area. And what's in many ways very interesting is that we haven't converged on what is the right solution, and that we're still debating and trying to sort out what is the proper balance. Famously, you had someone, Thomas Jefferson, writing a letter to a disgruntled patent applicant taking on the role before we had a PTO, but explaining very eloquently what's very interesting about ideas. And he did it far more eloquently than I'm about to do, but talking about a candle that can then be passed to someone else with a candle. My candle can light someone else's, and this thing can spread in this very interesting way. And so you have this access notion right there before you. It's like, we have a good idea, a bright way to do something. Everybody could share it. But then that immediately leads to the question of, well, how are private entities going to be able to pay for this if it turns out this is something that can be copied easily once it's been created? And that's, Gil was talking about these expenses, and you have the R&D that goes into it up front. You have the FDA approval. It can be extremely expensive. And that's just talking about the one therapy. But what about all the other ones that failed? Right? You have all these failures. And so you have this huge amount of money that needs to be made up. And so then we have to have some system in place to provide exclusivity. But at the same token, you have the patients who would like to have access to it today, saying, well, wait, Jefferson was saying how easily this could spread. I could make this very cheaply, and I could save somebody today. And how are we supposed to make that balance? And it certainly is something we're still wrestling with. So, Janet, I can just relay the difficulty. I don't have any great insights. This is a debate that we've had for a long time. But to add to Gil's point, you do have you balance. You have the initial inventor with a patent, and we're going to talk more about scope. There you have this issue of inventor with a certain scope, and you can imagine that preventing or maintaining a high price that's hopefully going to recoup some of those R&D costs and those regulatory costs. And so that's a balance between the patients today and the inventor today. But just as Gil was saying, there's these future issues. If the patents are broad or too broad, then future innovators are just going to not be allowed in. The fencing is too wide, and that impacts future patients who would have said, well, the current therapy was okay, but actually, if we had had more competition, maybe that would have driven down price, but we would have had another choice, and maybe I'm the kind of patient who that other therapy would have been better for. And so there's all this goes into the mix, and it's something that certainly needs to be worked on. We haven't solved it by any matter, but it's something that we're hopefully converging towards better solutions.
Drew, thank you. Drew, you've shared with us the PTO's role in fostering innovation, particularly for life-saving treatments, and thank you for that. I wonder, as you're hearing the conversation, anything to add on this notion of balance from your perspective?
Yeah, a few points. I think first, I agree that balance is the key word, right? I think you need to and I don't want to repeat too much, but what can't be lost in that balance equation is the incentives to innovate, because if as was said by other panel members, if people don't have the incentives, you can have all the access you want, but the access that you'll have will eventually be outdated, and we won't have the advancement that we all need as a society. So balance is certainly the key word. The only other point that I'd like to make is there is a discussion about, which I agree with, about scope being too broad. If we issue a patent that has too much coverage, it's too broad and covers too much, it could wrongfully preclude others from entering the market. But the converse is also true. If you issue a patent with a scope that's too narrow from what an inventor, an innovator rightfully deserves, then they're not going to be able to reap the incentives that they should be getting. And that gets me back to the word balance being the key. And part of what I believe is critical for people like myself and the USPTO is to make sure that we're finding that Goldilocks approach of the scope and making sure when you issue patents they are of the right scope, and that is the million-dollar question, so to speak.
So I'm looking at our time. We're going to dive a little bit into the detail now. And a number of you and folks online have reviewed the report, or the policy brief that we released this morning. And Gil, I thought we might start with you. As we indicate in our report, so typically, and as Drew mentioned in his remarks, the PTO generally requires applicants to provide a full written description of their invention for all the reasons described. But it made an exception to this rule several years ago when it comes to therapeutic antibodies. Could you talk from your perspective around why the PTO may have made the exception and why it no longer makes sense, as outlined in the PTO's memo released about a month ago?
So I don't know if...
Recognizing we don't have... How many patent attorneys do we have in the room? We've got a couple, but...
Yeah, so I don't know that the PTO set out to make an exception. The way I sort of rationalized what happened was, if you go back actually to the late 90s, when the well-characterized antigen test for written description was first proposed, back in the late 90s, DNA, therapeutic proteins, antibodies had just started to become recognized as very important in healthcare and drug discovery and development. And at that time, the science had not yet evolved to a point where characterizing these large chemicals, basically, an antibody is a large chemical. The technology just hadn't gotten to a point yet where characterizing these things was easy for inventors to do. I think also a thread running through that was that some people were worried that if an inventor were required to include too much structural information about what their biologic material was, that it would be too easy for a second person to come on and essentially copy the invention, but yet avoid the patent. So what I think what the Patent Office tried to do was to look at, there was another requirement beyond written description. It's called enablement. We don't have time to get into it, but I think a theory was that, if an applicant could sort of provide a description in the patent application that enabled the invention but didn't describe it, that might be an okay way to satisfy a written description. It certainly, I can sort of rationalize it today, but at this point, the methods of characterizing biologic materials have greatly improved. And point of fact, there have been subsequent developments in case law that make very clear that a written description requirement is a separate requirement from enablement. And just because you may enable something doesn't necessarily mean you've described it. And I had a nice example that I could have used, but I think we're a little short on time to sort of flush that out. But I'll go ahead and cede.
Thank you. Oscar, you've talked, in your research, you've talked about the notion of broad claims, reading some of your papers, and their impact on competition in the market, including the impact on emerging therapies that we've talked about this morning. I wonder, again, for the non-attorneys in the room, can you describe what you mean by broad claims? Maybe provide an example or two and describe, how one could address the situation.
Well, I'll see what I can do. And this might be where Gil was alluding to. There is this, to try to understand what broad claims, we were talking before, and Drew was mentioning sort of claims broader than someone's entitled to. So we're not talking about sort of the absolute size of something. It's absolute, or the size of the exclusivity that you get relative to how much you've disclosed, or I would say how much you've invented. And that can depend on the area of technology, and that's what's interesting here. I'll try to give an example that would hopefully is illustrative. Some guy walks in and says, I've invented this, right? You might have one right in front of you right now. You have a cup and a holder, and says, I've invented this. I'd like to apply for a patent. And the patent attorney smartly says, well, okay, that is this object you've built, and I see what you're doing here. You're trying to protect someone's hand. This is made out of cardboard. Does it have to be out of cardboard? And the inventor would say, well, no. The whole point was that it's an insulator. And you say, all right, well, let's write that down. Let's describe this in great detail, but let's go on and say, look, it's not important that this was cardboard. It needs to be an insulator. It could have been made from all sorts of other materials. And in fact, I can tell you exactly what it needs to do. It needs to insulate the hot from the liquids inside and keep my hand from getting discomfort from the heat. And so, what's interesting there, we're talking about broad claims. Here you have an object, and then you have somebody disclosing in broader detail various different alterations. And that's sort of the invention. And in that area, when we're talking just about the disclosure requirements in U.S. patent law, then we'd say in that example, you could claim relatively broadly because you're able to understand what's going on here and describe it in great detail. Other areas are different. And so this is sort of an interesting sort of history of science. We don't have any incandescent lamps, I think, here, but there's a famous case from the 1890s about incandescent lamps. There was a competitor, Edison. They're coming up with filaments that were going to go into incandescent lamps. And they'd come up with the idea that if you carbonized, they used carbonized paper. You could put it into an evacuated bulb, put some current through it, and it would glow for a certain amount of time. and they applied for a patent for it. And you could imagine the same story. They walk into the office of a patent attorney, they have their bulb and say, hey, this is my filament, I would like to get a patent on it. And then the patent attorney's like, okay, well, how else could you solve this problem? What variations on this? And turned out they actually tried to claim quite broadly in the patent, but they weren't able to disclose anything else. They said, well, we did this by trial and error. We don't actually know why it works. This does work, but we can't really provide you with any discussion of other materials that might work. And so it turns out they did try to claim more broadly. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ultimately invalidated that patent or that broad claim, said you've gone too far. Right? You've gone beyond what you've invented. You've gone beyond the stuff that you've been able to visualize or conceive in your own head. And so what becomes interesting is we can talk about the breadth of claims, but it depends often on the details of the technology. And you do have at least, there's various things that go into it, but one can imagine a spectrum between very predictable arts, where you can very much predict what other materials might be useful for this, to trial and error, like something like the filaments in the incandescent lamp patent case, where with trial and error or serendipity, you can't visualize anything else. And so the question ends up being, with monoclonal antibodies, where are we on that spectrum? And are we getting it right? That's my best explanation of this.
Drew, I know you had the opportunity to talk a little bit with us about your recent clarification or guidance, update to your guidance last month. I wonder if you might, we discussed it a little bit in our report. Any other details you could share for folks in the room and online?
Sure. I think, I can't go back, and I don't know exactly what in 2008 were the deciding factors, but in speaking to people at that time, I think it was accurately characterized that it was not an attempt to create an exception to written description. Rather, it was that the feeling was at that time, given the state of the technology, that it was appropriate that you would understand what an antibody was, and that would be properly described if the antigen were identified. And as technology has evolved, excuse me, as technologies have evolved, that proved to be untrue. And then with the advent of the Supreme Court, or the Federal Circuit case, excuse me, where they clearly stated, no, for a proper description, you need to describe the antibody itself. That was the genesis behind the memo.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm looking at our time. I want to be sure we leave enough time for questions. I'm going to switch gears again. So Drew talked about in his remarks how important it is for all of us in the public, patients, industry, others, to provide input. And Mark, the National Health Council has done so much in terms of providing input and being a voice for patients to what goes on in Congress and the administration. Can you talk a little bit about that? And how it might apply here, and then I'd love to come back to you, Drew, and maybe expand on some of your remarks.
Sure. The patient community has been active in this space for many, many years. The evolution has been quite robust, even in our lifetimes. If you think of the creation of the Hatch-Waxman Act, that was clearly a congressional sanctioned compromise between how patents are used and how we provide access to generics. Something the patient community was very much involved in, very much appreciated. The creation of the Orphan Drug Act, while not patent law, created exclusivities in the market for products that treat rare diseases. Again, another balancing act done at the congressional level. We've worked with FDA and HHS on the implementation of those activities. The biosimilars legislation a decade ago was another opportunity for a compromise between patent law and exclusivities. The patient community led an effort called Dormant Therapies to drive the creation of a new pathway for products that didn't qualify for a patent, but had good social utility. And think about that for a second. Patent law is a relatively technical area of the law. There's no requirement to get a patent that it be useful for social good. Clearly, that's part of the intent, but there's no requirement. And there are, in some instances, or by some estimations at NIH, hundreds of thousands of potential medicines that could now be developed as science has evolved that could address unmet medical need that currently are not able to get a patent. That's something the patient community cares a lot about. So we have to think about how we drive social utility in this space. And I want to make just two real quick points. I know we're running short on time, but one is this. About 2 years ago, the National Health Council evaluated nearly 200 proposals that looked at how you can drive healthcare costs down. When we evaluated those proposals against a patient-centered framework, we ended up with about 50 different kinds of proposals, because we eliminated all the ones that said they would reduce costs by eliminating care, not very patient-centered.
Yeah.
But when you looked at the policies that were left, there were only a small handful, and we evaluated them for ones that had data to demonstrate whether or not they could actually drive down costs. The one area where there's great data is when there's competition in the market.
Yes.
And I want to underscore that when you have a patent that is overly broad, and again, I don't think anybody's blaming the PTO for this, the environment evolves. And it's evolving incredibly fast. When you look at the rate of artificial intelligence, science, where we're going in the last decade is completely unlike where we were a decade before. So we have to recognize this evolution is going to continue, and we need to be willing to step up and say, when it's overly broad, and it's going to eliminate other products coming into the space to treat that condition or related conditions, that give you the potential to have better or different treatments that meet your medical or personal needs and drive down costs, we need to get that balance right. Constant evolution here as we move forward.
Before we go to Drew, Gil, can I ask you the same question? Like, how does industry engage with the PTO? Is it just when you have an invention, or are there other ways?
No, I think the PTO and industry engage with each other actually quite well through partnership meetings, for example.
Okay.
There has been engagement industry with the PTO on international harmonization issues, for example. In theory, a patentability outcome in the United States should be similar to the patentability outcome in Europe, in Japan, for example. But if that's area, frankly, where we could actually do a better job together in influencing policy, because unfortunately, at the European Patent Office, the patentability decisions on antibodies in particular actually can be quite different than outcomes in the United States Patent Office. Ironically, it's sort of relatively easy at the European Patent Office to get some of these very broad claims, and broad in the sense that it's beyond the scope of the disclosure that's in the patent, because broad isn't necessarily a bad thing. It depends on what's disclosed in the patent. That it can be much easier at the European Patent Office to get broad claims, and appropriately broad claims, than it is to get a claim on an individual, fully defined, fully characterized antibody. So it's an odd a place to be, I think, for that. The solution is not to bring U.S. in line with Europe. The solution is to try to influence Europe to get more in line with the U.S. Position on this. So that's an area where we have worked together, and it's an area where I think we could definitely do more.
Drew, we were we were delighted to hear about all the work that you do around getting public input. And I would say, we do a lot of work in this area. We work with a number of groups across the healthcare spectrum. And my guess is many are unfamiliar with how to provide input. Like, any advice for us on how we can support you?
Sure, and thank you for the question, and thank you for the plug on the partnership meetings, because that is a great way to support us. In recent years, we've really tried to increase the number of partnership meetings, and let me tell you a little bit about those. They are basically usually technology-based. So a particular area of the USPTO, such as our 1600 Technology Center, which handles biotechnology, has one of the longest standing partnership meetings that we have, but they're in every technology. They will have partnership meetings that get advertised in advance, and basically the agendas are joint agendas from USPTO and the public based on input that we've received, and they try to address issues particular to that technology and the examination process relative to that technology. And it is a great way for us to have an informal back and forth in these partnership meetings. If for those of you, if any of you haven't gone to any of them, I certainly would urge you to look them up. I always get wonderful feedback about the partnerships. We've actually gone from having 2 or 3 a year to last year, I believe we had 12. Because we've tried to again expand at least to every technology. Some areas are even having 2 a year, so they've been really helpful. That would be one way to engage. Another way, and this gets back to the guidance when we issue, is when we issue a significant change in guidance or even larger policies. We usually do so with a request for comments, and they're published in the Federal Register and the Official Gazette, and they seek comment from the public, and basically there would be a comment, usually a comment period. Sometimes we always accept comments and we just say we're open for comments all the time, but in particular issues we'll have a period where we'll ask people to give us feedback. One of the tricks for us, and I know we're out of time, one of the tricks for us is as we're getting comment, we also have 8,000 examiners looking at 600,000 patent applications a year. So there's always that balance of where they should be in this loop. We usually end up coming out with guidance, put them on the guidance, and get comments, and we'll adjust as needed, rather than, it's very odd to have the PTO saying, we think the guidance should be this, but examiners don't follow it now. That's a very odd situation. So we will get comments, and I will tell you, in recent years, we've had this situation, and we have made changes responsive to the public feedback in certain areas and come out with new guidance responsive to that. So that is a way. I'll also just say one way to get apprised of all of this information, whether it's partnerships or Federal Register notices, is to go to our website and sign up for, and I don't remember the exact name, but it's just you get automatic notifications. You can put in your email address and you'll get an automatic notification of events that are occurring at PTO, so you'll become apprised of everything that you could give feedback to.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and I know there's a lot of interest here. We've got a few minutes. What I'd like to do is turn to our audience, see questions for our panel.
Hi, Stacy Bridges, Veterans Vision. I'm concerned about a patent for cannabis, 6630507. I believe it is. You always speak, and I hate to always be the cannabis girl, but you talk about innovations and wanting to get drugs on the market that actually help, and there has been studies that's been done for the past 50 years. NIH has actually given tax money to Israel to study the effects of cannabis. I asked this question as a representing veterans, because we've got 22 veterans committing suicide and 1 soldier committing suicide every day, and they're taking a toxic cocktail of meds, and these meds can have horrific side effects. Is there a pay to delay to keep drugs like cannabis off the market and out of the hands of the people who want it, because it is a weed that anybody can grow and it may affect your sales or your your profit shares? I mean, people are literally dying for a cure. What do you have to say about cannabis and the vilification of that natural plant?
That's a challenging question. A lot of parts of the question. So, we at the Patent Office need to apply the laws to every application, and part of what we don't do is have a value judgment on the benefits or lack thereof of the inventions that our examiners are looking at. So they have the patent statutes, and really you apply those statutes. Now there is one of the statutes talks about being useful, but it's a very broad useful. It's not a value. Is it, successful in curing X or Y? But for the most part, the value judgment component is not taken into consideration, and so something like cannabis. If it meets the statutes, the examiner will proceed and issue the patent.
Thank you. Other questions? Oh yes, there's someone in the back.
My name's Allison Hatton. I'm a patent attorney at Sanofi. And my question is for Gil, and also I think Mr. Hirschfeld could also answer. I'm wondering how you are engaging the ex-US patent offices to come to the table on some of these patent examination issues. In our experience, we've been trying to also speak with them, and I feel like the EPO in particular is a group that we've been trying to engage, and they listen, but it's not clear that they're hearing us or that there's any movement at the EPO to make similar adjustments in their examination policies.
Yeah. So from time to time, we reach out to the EPO and ask to meet, and they've accepted from time to time, and we do have.
Can you say what the EPO is for folks?
The European Patent Office.
Okay.
Yeah. So they generally will agree to meet and listen and talk. I share your sort of summary of those talks. They listen, but it doesn't always feel like they necessarily really take the feedback and make any changes. So what I've sort of told the group, if you will, is continue to have conversations with the EPO examiners as they're examining your patent applications. I think my sense is that there's a little bit of a lack of connection that the European patent examiners are making between the claim scopes that they're allowing and the actual effects in the marketplace. They're sort of, I think, unaware, and it strikes me as a little odd that that's the case, given that at the European Patent Office Opposition Division, which is a place third parties can go to complain about basically inappropriately granted patents, the docket at that opposition division is chock full of innovators fighting other innovators. It's amazing actually how much activity goes on in Europe with respect to the granting of patents that sort of interfere with not just sort of the protection of the invention from a copy, but the invention from other inventions. So I don't have a magic bullet to throw out there. I just say keep trying.
Yeah, from the PTO perspective, we have routine meetings with other offices to discuss harmonization issues where topics such as this could be raised and try to understand where we can better harmonize and to get a feeling of when there's differences, what is the right path to solve those differences.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Larry Lamont with.
Here's a.
Hi, I'm Larry Lamont with Patients for Biologics Safety and Access, and but I have a question, Drew. Is with the pace of technology change in our society, how do your 8,000 examiners keep up? Because what Mark was talking about, 10 years ago, it's now like the technology changes like monthly. So I was just curious to how do they catch up, and then what do you all do to make sure that they know what is happening and can understand what is happening in the context of today?
Right. So from a pure numbers perspective, and I know you're asking more than just numbers, we have in the last, I'll say 7 or 8 years, had to hire numerous examiners to be able to keep up with the pace of applications that were being filed. We had 1 year where we hired 1,500 examiners in a single year, and you can imagine the stress that puts on the whole entire system. But we had to do so because of the increase in the number of filings that were coming in. We're now, I believe, at a size where I don't see us greatly expanding. Our plans in the next few years are basically to hire at attrition levels so that we're keeping the agency about the same size. And as examiners, I mentioned before, examiners' production systems change as they increase. So as examiners will become more advanced, they produce more work, and I believe we'll be able to stay up with the workload in that way. From a technology front, when we do hire examiners, we hire them obviously based on the particular technologies. So in, say, the biotech area, we're going to hire many PhDs, but if somebody who's examining, say, sleeves for cups, they're not going to be a PhD. So you try to match the degree, and then we try to have continuing education where it is appropriate. One of the things that we do is we either send examiners to companies or have some people from the public come into USPTO, and members of the public can actually work with companies, for example, can give demonstrations to examiners and explain technologies that those examiners see. That's been a really helpful way to keep examiners abreast of the latest technology. And remember, every application that they do, they are learning the cutting edge, so to speak, or they're learning. So just the fact of examining is going to help them learn as the technologies advance.
All right, I think we're at time. So please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. Thank you so much for joining. And thanks to all of you, both online and in the room, for joining the Bipartisan Policy Center on this important topic. So thank you, and safe travels.